In the aftermath of Tuesday's mass shooting in Uvalde, we continue to learn shocking new details about what happened that day. On Friday, the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety confirmed that Border Patrol agents, along with other law enforcement officers, were told to hold back while the gunman was locked in that room with a class full of kids.
Hey, for the benefit of hindsight, where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision, period. There's no excuse for that. But again, I wasn't there, but I'm just telling you, from what we know, we believe there should have been an entry at that as soon as you can.
We also heard about a series of harrowing 911 calls made by the children inside of the school.
At 12:46, she said that she could hear the police next door. At 12:50, shots are fired. They could be heard over the 911 call. And at 12:51 is very loud and sounds like the officers are moving children out of the room. At that time, the first child that called was outside before the call cuts off.
This comes as we learn more about the time it took for police to end the school shooting in Uvalde. There are still questions about the gunman's final 90 minutes, from when he first jumped out of his pickup truck carrying an AR-15 to law enforcement announcing that the shooter was dead. And after days of conflicting information from the police, we are learning now that a school resource officer was not inside the school when the gunman entered. That officer also did not confront the gunman outside of the school. Here's what we heard from law enforcement on Wednesday and how that story changed by Thursday.
There was a brave Consolidated Independent School District resource officer that approached him, engaged him, and at that time,
was there a school officer on campus, and was that school officer armed? Because that's what we've been told.
So at this time, no. No, there was not an officer readily available armed. No.
What, was there an officer?
No.
Minutes after the gunman entered the school, the first police arrived onto the scene. They exchanged gunfire with the shooter, who then locked himself in a classroom for about an hour. According to Uvalde police, 2 officers were shot and wounded at this point in time. But in that hour, frustrated parents rushed to the school and urged the police gathered outside to charge into the building and to stop the gunman.
Man, y'all can't be like that, man. Y'all can't be like that when there's people.
Yes, I do. Get across the street. Because I'm having to deal with you. Get across the street. Get across the street. We have other stuff to do. We're going to back up or you're going to walk into that gate and get him. You got to get violent with us. Go get violent with them. I'm going to have the rifles here.
You know that there are kids, right? They're little kids. They don't know how to defend themselves.
Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Ken Dilanian, who has been covering all of these developments closely, especially the response by law enforcement in Uvalde. Ken, I really don't even have any words after that presser. I do want to start, though, by getting your top-line reactions to that press conference that was just held by the director of the Texas Department for Public Safety. Frankly, what didn't we learn from that press conference?
Katie, my colleague Tom Winter, who's been covering a lot of these mass shootings, called this the worst law enforcement failure in modern American history when it comes to mass shootings. That's what we've learned, that this was far worse than our worst imagination of what was going on here. We thought there would be some plausible, if flawed, explanation for the long delay it took police to respond. But what they are now acknowledging is that they just made a colossal misjudgment. Essentially, they decided that what was an active shooter situation had transitioned to a suspect barricaded, which calls for the police to then wait for the tactical unit. Essentially, Katie, they assumed that all the children were dead because he had fired multiple rounds into multiple classrooms, but all the children were not dead. And they were, in fact, they were, as you said, they were calling 911. And yet, and there was no real explanation of why those 911 calls, why that information was not transmitted to the police on the scene. We also learned that the scene commander made this decision, and the scene commander was the chief of the Uvalde Independent School District Police Force, a force of 6 officers. There were heavily armed federal agents with years of experience congregating outside that school, wanting to go in, and this local police school district officer was in command and was saying, no, we're not going to go in. We're going to wait for a tactical unit. It just boggles the mind. And while the commander of the Texas Department for Public Safety said that he was aware of 2 children who called 911 and survived, we know of at least 1 child who died and whose grandmother said that she died after she called 911. It's just infuriating. And the other thing is that video you showed, those poor parents, they were absolutely in the right. While they were demanding to go in, there were some children who were alive in that room with an active shooter, and police were sitting there waiting an hour for a tactical team to come in. Katie.
Ken, I'm speechless, because you're basically saying that the children were alive, could have been alive, if more action had been taken by law enforcement. The natural question I'm going to ask you now is there any accountability then? If what we're learning so far is that this inaction caused the death of these children, is there any accountability for the law enforcement officers that failed to do their duty?
I think there will be accountability, as there was in Parkland when there was a school resource officer who it was found was derelict of duty and did not go in and confront the mass shooter, which was his entire job. And he was fired, essentially, and charged with a crime. I really think that after what we learned today, it's a very real possibility that there will be a criminal inquiry. Now, you know, of course, even as I say that, look, this was a judgment that was made presumably in good faith by the chief, presumably a pretty inexperienced chief of a very small police force. So the real question is why that wasn't overridden by more experienced law enforcement officers who were there, by the sheriff, by the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas Rangers. There were Border Patrol people on scene. There were Customs and Border Protection. Eventually, may have been FBI people there. Why this one chief of this small police force was allowed to make this decision that, no, we're not going in? And then why the 911 information was not relayed, or if it was and it wasn't acted on, that's another huge issue. So I do think, I mean, experts in mass shootings and law enforcement officials who are watching this are aghast. They're horrified. And I think there will be a national call for accountability here, Katie.
Along that vein, Congressman Joaquin Castro wrote a letter to the head of the FBI, Ken. He wrote a letter to Christopher Wray saying, we need a federal probe to establish the timeline of events and to provide an accurate account. In your experience, is that common in these kinds of investigations? I mean, what would be added to the knowledge base here if that type of investigation is done in terms of what happened with that law enforcement response?
It's actually fairly common that the FBI is called in to conduct an independent investigation. And in this case, the reason would be, while today the Texas Department of Public Safety seemed to play it straight and give an accurate rendition of the timeline, everything they had, it looked like. The other day, the head of that agency was on the podium with the governor and praising the law enforcement response and saying that a quick law enforcement response saved lives, which was inaccurate and seemed political. And so that's why you have some members of Congress and others saying, wait a minute, can this Texas state agency, which is under the control of this Republican governor with very strong views about gun rights and assault rifles, can this agency conduct a fair and impartial investigation of what happened here, or should it be turned over to the FBI? That's the question. I think you're going to hear more calls for an independent FBI investigation of what happened here, Katie.
Well, Ken Dilanian, we appreciate all of this updated information, and we're all looking to your reporting and following you to be able to see what's going on. So thank you for coming and giving us this update. I'm still stunned. I can't believe it.
Me too. Great to be with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken.